Okay, take your Bible and turn to the book of 1 Kings. Tonight we'll be looking at 1 Kings chapters 1 through 11, and then bouncing back and forth to the parallel over in 2 Chronicles at times. In 1 Kings chapter 1, we're going to transition from David to Solomon. We're going to see yet another effort to supplant David before that takes place. And we'll see the death of King David, which takes place about the year 970 BC. So not quite 1,000 years before the birth of Jesus. David had reigned for 40 years, 40 and a half to be specific, at the time of his death. And so his rulership is separated from the rulership of Christ by roughly 1,000 years. Now, in chapter 1, the first thing that we're presented with is David's failing health. Now, if you flip over to 1 Chronicles for just a moment, chapter 28, we have in 1 Chronicles 28 and 29, David's handing over of the kingdom to Solomon in more detail, and instruction concerning the temple and the loyalty of the people that they're supposed to show to Solomon and so forth. But here in 1 Kings, we have just a synopsis of the circumstances. David is old, advanced in years. Well, how old is old? Methuselah lived 969 years. Moses was about 120 years when God took him up to Mount Pisgah and let him see the promised land from a distance, and then took him at that point. How old is old? Well, David had been king for 40 years, but at this point he's 70 years old, or perhaps 69 at this point. He's not dead quite yet. The point that's being made here, now you remember in 2 Samuel, as David ages, he reaches the point that when he goes out into battle, he's a danger to himself. He's in danger of being injured or killed because he's not as young as he used to be. And finally, his mighty men say, no, we're not letting you go out to battle anymore. You're the light of Israel, and we're going to protect you. So somewhere in his 50s, 60s, somewhere in there, his health has begun to fade. Well, you think about the life that the man has lived. He has spent a good part of the early part of his adult life in battle, as a warrior, on the run, living in holes and caves and under a lot of stress. So it's hardly surprising. He's lived a tough physical life in his early life. As king, he has led in battle and fought. He's not a general that sits on a horse on the hill from a distance directing. He's in the thick of the battle. So he's had a hard physical life in a lot of respects. So now he's old. At least he's worn out. And he's cold. I understand that better now. The older I get, the colder I get. Used to, when I was younger, I would get cold about the end of October and get warm again about the end of February. And now I can wear a jacket pretty much year round. David's old, he's cold, they cover him, and he just doesn't get warm. Think about what do old people complain about? We're cold. Why are we cold? Well, you believe the makers of Geritol, it's iron poor blood. But it's a natural aspect of advancing years. We're less physically active. We have less strength. Our body mass is less energy consuming muscle. And so we get chilled more easily. So his advisors, his counselors, dare we say, his handlers have a solution. And it's an interesting solution in that this was a common remedy right up through the Middle Ages, and even still in some parts of the Eastern world, although medically speaking, it's totally debunked. Let's find a pretty girl. Well, let's pause for a second and think about this. David had Michal. He didn't have any children with her. Once they were separated, even after he reclaimed her when he became king, he didn't have anything to do with it. But he had Maacah, he had Hadith, he had Abigail. He had a number of wives. Plus, when Saul dies, who else? He inherits Saul's harem as well, Saul's wives. In fact, God scolds him about that when it comes to Bathsheba. If you needed more wives, I'd have given you more. I gave you your predecessors' wives. I'd have given you more. But you had to go steal Bathsheba. Well, he had Bathsheba too. So he's got a house full of wives. The early ones, Maacah, Hadith, Michal, Abigail, Saul's wives and concubines, even if they were younger, they're all going to be getting on up there age-wise, most likely. Ladies in their, let's be modest and say 40s and up. His advisors, his medical counselors and so forth, we've got a solution for you. We'll get you a pretty young thing to keep you warm. The idea in that ancient day was that you get a young, vibrant, energetic young woman, and somehow her energy, her vitality would pass to him. He'd be interested and perk up. Well, his servants said to him, let a young woman be sought for my lord the king. Let her wait on the king and be in his service. Let her lie in your arms that my lord the king may be warm. So they sought for a beautiful young woman throughout all the territory of Israel. All right, we're going to have a beauty contest, basically. All over the countryside. The winner, Abishag. Abishag, the Shunammite. And they brought her to the king. Notice what it says about her in verse 4. The young woman was very beautiful. She was of service to the king and attended to him, but the king knew her not. So, her name, Abishag, means her father wanders or roams. It can also be translated, her father is a curse. She's from Shunem. That's why she's called a Shunammite. Don't confuse Shunammite here with Shulamite over in the Song of Solomon. No relation whatsoever. Shulamite, Shulamith, means perfect or peaceful. It's from the Hebrew word shalom, meaning peace. Here, Shunammite is from the town of Shunem, which is a little town in the territory of Issachar, which is what we would recognize in the New Testament as part of Galilee. It's in the north. It's about 18 miles southwest of the Sea of Galilee. It's right on the northern edge of the valley of Megiddo. It's close to Jezreel. And it's about 6 miles east of the town of Megiddo. If you look at the Bible, the maps in the back of your Bible, you'll find it there in the valley of Megiddo, right on the edge. The opinion, the idea, her vitality would spur David's health and energy. She did serve as basically his nurse, his attendant. She was not his. They may have slept together, but that's all they did.
You mean they weren't intimate?
They were not intimate. That's right. It says he knew her not, and that's the biblical sense of to know her. He was not intimate with her at all. She would be considered at least his concubine, his wife. A concubine in that day was essentially think of it as a junior wife, a second-class wife. She had rights. She was, as much as any of his other wives, She was his property, you might say. She was to be exclusive to him, but she would not, any offspring that she bore him would not inherit at the same level as his wife, or wives in this case. She didn't bear him any offspring, so that's a moot point anyhow. She was with him basically as his caretaker, or his companion, his nurse, for him to get warm, stay warm. His health is failing. Now, there's something important about that fact, that his health is failing. In Eastern nations, and especially in that ancient time, it was generally the opinion of the men, at any rate, that if a man couldn't be intimate with a woman, a ruler particularly, then his ability to rule, his manhood, and therefore his ability to rule, had left him, and he didn't have any business being the king. So it's understandable then the king's servants, they want to keep him on top of it. They're loyal to him. They want to keep him at the top of his game. Well, what we see here is the nation poised on a razor's edge. David is old. By our standards, he's really not that old. He's 69, 70 years old. All of us know, who knows how many people of that age and older who are still vital and active and busy, and in some cases still working. I think of a gentleman that I know who worked as a door greeter at Walmart there in Fayetteville for years. As long as I've been in Georgia, he's been there. He told me last year that he was 76, and he's just as energetic and vibrant as anybody that works there. Well, David wasn't that energetic at this point. His health is breaking down. He's wearing out. He's had a hard physical life, demanding life. So you come down here to get to verse 6 or verse 5. Adonijah, the son of Haggith, exalts himself. Now compare David and Adonijah. Adonijah seems to be the oldest remaining son. There was Amnon and Absalom. Absalom murdered Amnon. Later, Joab murders Absalom. David mourned for Absalom. Absalom had been the oldest, seemingly the heir to the throne. It was Absalom who had created a coup attempt to try to overthrow David and to murder him, and he wound up being murdered himself. David had given express orders not to hurt him, and Joab did anyway. Well, now here is Adonijah, seemingly the oldest remaining son. David has a passel of kids. You've got Adonijah on this end, and we're going to see Solomon, seemingly the youngest, at the other end. What a contrast between David the king and Adonijah, the I want to be king. If you look at the two, David is old. Adonijah is probably in his 30s, 40s, maybe, young enough to be very active and energetic. David is tired. Adonijah is full of energy. Notice what it says about him here. He prepared himself chariots and horsemen, 50 men to run before him. His father had never at any time displeased him by asking, "Why have you done thus and so?" He was also a very handsome man. He was born next after Absalom. He conferred with Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and with Abiathar the priest, and they followed Adonijah and helped him. So he's the oldest son. That's presumably the next heir to the throne. He's handsome. He looks like a king. You know, it's interesting. You look at the men who have been proposed as kings. King Saul, tall, handsome, stood head above everybody else. He was much bigger and looked very kingly. And Saul turned out not so good, didn't he? And then you've got Absalom. Absalom was a beautiful man, a handsome man, made all the little girls' hearts just go pity pat. He looked like a king, but nope, God didn't. He was not good. What about David's brother, Eliab, his oldest brother? God sends Samuel to the house of Jesse to anoint a new king to take Saul's place. And when he comes to Jesse's house, he meets Eliab, the firstborn of 7 sons, and he's tall and handsome and good looking. And what's Samuel's first response? Surely this is the one. He looks like a king. And you just hear the heavenly buzzer go, not him. And it's David, short and ruddy or reddish complected. Doesn't look like a king as far as the common perception of a king. And now along comes Adonijah, his son, and shades of his older brother Absalom, half brother. He's got designs on the throne. And he enlists the general of the armies, Joab, and the high priest, Abiathar. And now he gets some other help to proclaim himself king. But notice at verse 8, the significant statement, Zadok the priest, Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and Nathan the prophet, along with Shimei and Rei and David's mighty men, were not with Adonijah. So here an Adonijah attempts to seize the kingdom. His mother was Haggith. She was one of the early wives of David. He was born while David was still at Hebron. So we're talking 30, 33, 34 years ago, at least. He may be age 40 at this point. Her name seems to mean dancer. Well, he sends men running ahead of him, just like Absalom. He has men with chariots, just like Absalom. He's full of energy. He's good looking. He's everything that David is not from a worldly point of view at this stage. And he's got influential friends. Got the chief of staff of the army. Got the high priest, Abiathar. And so he goes and sets up a coronation. Verse 9. Sacrificed sheep and oxen and fattened cattle by the serpent's stone, or the Hebrew word. I'm sitting here looking at an English Standard Version. It says the serpent's stone. It's Zoheleth, there at verse 9. Well, that's at the spring of En-Rogel. En-Rogel, if you look at a map of Jerusalem, you've got the valley on the east side, the Kidron Valley, and you've got the valley that kind of starts over on the west side and curls around the south of the city, and that's the Hinnom Valley. We get the name Gehenna from that valley. And the two of them come together at a confluence to the southeast corner of the city. Just past where the two valleys come together is a spring, En-Rogel. And that's the location of Adonijah's coronation and his sacrifices. Well, it's a site that would be visible from Jerusalem up on the mountain, up on the hill above it. It's downhill from what would ultimately be the site of the future temple. But as you look at verse 10, he did not invite Nathan the prophet or Benaiah or the mighty men or Solomon, his brother. And there's something significant about that. Now, he's got all of his officials, all of the royal officers and whatnot that are there. He's invited everybody that's anybody except these guys. And that's significant. By not inviting Solomon, there is no possibility of peaceful coexistence between them. If he was interested in peaceful coexistence, he could have invited Solomon, and Solomon being there, that would have effectively said, I have no designs to take the throne away from Adonijah. He did not invite Solomon. And that sets up what's about to take place at this point. Now, there are a couple of other things to point out who is not there. I said Abiathar is the high priest. He's the priest in Jerusalem. Zadok is also a priest. Benaiah is a mighty man of the second class. He's the captain of the king's bodyguard. Nathan is a prophet. Shimei and Rai and the mighty men, we're talking about a group of basically 40 prominent, influential individuals, all faithful servants of David, who are deliberately omitted. The implication seems to be David and these guys at this point, they have no idea what's going on. They've not been invited and they've not been forewarned. What's Adonijah doing? He's doing what Absalom had done. He's trying to do this on the sly and present the nation with a fait accompli, a done deal. Now, most of the people, had this gone forward, most of the nation probably would just have fallen in line right behind him, because he's the oldest son. He's to the common folks, he's the logical choice. He looks like a king. He's acting like a king. Now they have a coronation feast with these obvious omissions, and David seemingly is ignorant until Nathan intervenes, Nathan the prophet. Well, now, it's never stated God tells Nathan to go do this, though it may be, and I want to emphasize, may be a reasonable supposition. Nathan goes to Bathsheba. Bathsheba is the newest wife, basically, next to Abishag, who's a concubine, as far as we know. Bathsheba is the mother of Solomon. Have you heard? Have you heard what Adonijah is doing? Adonijah, the son of Haggith. Now, why is he Adonijah, the son of Haggith, when Nathan speaks to Bathsheba? Well, Haggith is a co-wife. She's another one of David's wives. We don't know a lot about the relationships between David's wives. We know that Michal, Saul's daughter, she was not an easy woman to get along with after everything was said and done. We know that Abigail is celebrated for her wisdom and her good sense. We don't know anything about the other wives, basically. Bathsheba was seduced by David or forced by David, whatever. We don't know the intimate particulars there. But Haggith was one of the early wives. Bathsheba was one of the later wives. In any relationship like that, there's invariably friction. If Adonijah becomes king, what does that do for Haggith? She becomes the queen mother. And that doesn't exactly put her in the driver's seat, but that gives her a lot of sway, a lot of influence. And Bathsheba, along with all the other wives, would become by right Adonijah's property. He may not have any interest in any of them, but he inherits the harem, basically. So Nathan goes to Bathsheba. Have you heard? Here's what's going on. And notice how he says it. Adonijah, the son of Haggith, has become king, and David, our Lord, does not know it. Now, Nathan is describing what Adonijah is trying to do, to have himself proclaimed king by his own institution. David is still alive, so as long as David is still alive, that's subject to David's accepting it, or David's being forced to accept it. So now Nathan says, you need to go talk to David. Let me advise you to save your own life and the life of your son Solomon. And this is very important because Solomon is not there at Adonijah's coronation. There is an implicit message that Solomon's life is in danger, and Bathsheba would be simply by virtue of being his mother. There would be no peaceful coexistence in this circumstance. We're going to see a contrast here in a minute between Adonijah's behavior and Solomon's, but it's ultimately Adonijah's going to do himself in. Go in at once to King David and say to him, did you not, my lord the king, swear to your servant, saying, Solomon your son shall reign after me, and he shall sit on my throne? Now, this is the first explicit statement about a pledge to Bathsheba, a promise to Bathsheba. Nathan knows about it, whether by having been told. David, Nathan is David's advisor. Nathan is David's confidant. It was Nathan that had gone to David back there in 2 Samuel chapter 12 and said, you're the man, and just pinned his hide to the wall about the whole affair with Bathsheba. So whether David told Nathan that he had promised, or whether Nathan knew this by inspiration, we don't know. Now, you will find some modern commentators, Walter Brueggemann is a prominent one among them, who say that basically Nathan was acting on his own here and trying to take the reins of and steer the kingdom just on his own. That's not the implication of the scriptures, as far as I understand it. This is his response as a prophet of God. You need to go remind David of his promise. And then you end up by asking, why then is Adonijah king? And while you're still speaking with the king, I will come in after you and confirm your words. Well, at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, all things shall be established. So Bathsheba goes to the king in his chamber. He's very old. Abishag the Shunammite was attending to him, so she's with him. She's going to presumably hear what's going on. She's going to know the implication. Abishag will understand the implication of all that's going on because it bears on her too. If Adonijah becomes king, she becomes Adonijah's property. If Solomon becomes king, she becomes Solomon's property. And she is young and vital, where some of the other wives, they're older, and it's not a big deal, perhaps, in their circumstances. But there's potential here on her part. Plus, she becomes a witness to whatever the king says. So Bathsheba goes to him, bows before him, pays homage to him, and he speaks, what do you want? You swore that Solomon, your son, would reign after you and sit on your throne. Now look here. Adonijah is king, although you don't know it. And here's what he's done. He's offered sacrifices of oxen and sheep and fattened cattle in abundance. He's invited all the sons of the king, Abiathar the priest, Joab the commander of the army, but Solomon he has not invited. Now there's an implication here. He's invited all the sons of the king except Solomon. Well, what does that tell us? All the rest of David's sons, he doesn't consider a threat. Why would he consider Solomon a threat? Solomon is seemingly the baby of the family. Is it known in the royal house that Solomon is David's choice? We don't know for sure. What we do see here is that Adonijah understands that Solomon, of all David's sons, Solomon is the one, for whatever reason, who would pose a threat to him as king. And so he excludes him, and that, by excluding him, his absence, even though it's not of Solomon's doing, his absence is a public statement that I don't support the king if Adonijah manages to hold on to the kingdom. And that puts his life in jeopardy. That's tantamount to a statement of rebellion. And so Bathsheba speaks. He has not invited Solomon, your servant. Now, my lord the king, the eyes of all Israel are on you to tell them who shall sit on the throne of my lord the king after him. Otherwise, it will come to pass that when my lord the king sleeps with his fathers, that I and my son Solomon will be counted offenders. Okay, so it's pretty plain. Nathan sets this plan in motion. Bathsheba implements it, carries out her part of it. Now Nathan comes in right behind in verses 22 through 27. She's still talking to the king. Here comes Nathan. Now, it was customary that when the king has an audience with his wife or with a counselor, a third party would not be there. So when Nathan comes in, Bathsheba's going to go out. What about Abishag? Well, we don't know about Abishag except that she was there when Bathsheba arrived. So Nathan carries out his part of the plan. Here is Nathan the prophet. My lord the king, have you said Adonijah shall reign after me and sit on my throne? So he starts with a question. Did you authorize this? There's an important principle in that question. He didn't ask, is this okay with you? He didn't ask, have you forbidden this? A whole lot of the religious community, a whole lot of Christendom operates on what we might call the Martin Luther principle. Martin Luther, a Middle Ages Catholic priest who became the founder of the Lutheran denomination. Martin Luther and a Swiss theologian named Ulrich Zwingli corresponded and debated between themselves about what the scriptures teach. And they parted company on the question of the authority of the scriptures. Because Zwingli's perspective was that we are authorized, if we're going to be God's people, we're authorized to do everything that God has authorized, everything God has commanded. If God didn't speak to it, we don't have any permission to do it. Luther's perspective was the other end of that. Luther said anything that God hasn't spoken about or hasn't forbidden, we can do. In other words, if God didn't speak to it, you can do what you want. Well, that's not what Nathan presents, is it? My lord the king, have you given permission for this? Have you authorized this? Adonijah shall be king and sit on my throne. Because here's what he's done. He's gone down, he's offered sacrifices, and he's invited all the king's sons and the army and the priests and so forth, and they're eating and drinking before him and saying, long live King Adonijah. So he's having a coronation feast. But then he goes on and says, but here's the list of who he didn't invite. And it's not just me. Zadok the priest, Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, Solomon. Has this thing been brought about by my lord the king, and you have not told your servants who should sit on the throne and follow you? Did you order this? He's not saying you didn't say not to do this. Did you give permission for this? So David's response shows he may be old and his health may be failing and he may be decrepit in some ways. You know, that's quite a contrast. Here's Adonijah, the man of health and action and vitality and energy, and David is huddled up trying to get warm and not feeling good and doesn't have a lot of energy, and he's not out in public like Adonijah. But he's not dead yet. And he's not befuddled or stupid. He shows some strength and some mental alertness. Call Bathsheba to me. So bring Bathsheba back in. And David reaffirms what he had already promised. Here's what I promised. I swore to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, saying, Solomon your son shall reign after me and sit on my throne in my place. And I'm reconfirming this today. Bathsheba's response, may my lord the king David live forever. Well, he's not going to in this world. But right here at verse 30, David has already decided what's going to happen, and he promised her at some point before. So you look at the solution that David implements in verses 32 to 35. Here's what you do: get Nathan, get Benaiah. They come in. You take my mighty men, the servants of your Lord, and you have Solomon ride on my own mule. Now, this is significant because the king's mule would be readily identifiable, well known. He would not go out with a passenger, with a rider, except in his royal livery, with his saddle or bridle, or the things that marked him as the king's mount. You take him and you put Solomon on him and ride him down to the spring of Gihon. Now, the Gihon spring is also at Jerusalem, but it's in the Kidron Valley. It's below Mount Olivet, the Mount of Olives. It's between what would ultimately be the Gate Beautiful, or the eastern gate of the temple, overlooking the Kidron Valley, and the Mount of Olives across the Kidron Valley. So it's down there in the valley, right in the side of all of Jerusalem, like the other one, like En Rogel, but closer. You take him down there, and here's what you do. Now, it's upstream, it's up the hill from the Serpent Stone, or from the En Rogel spring, and it's not affected by the outflow from the Hinnom Valley, which would ultimately be the future site of corruption. Human sacrifice would be offered there in 2 Chronicles chapter 28, chapter 33, 28 verse 3, chapter 33 verse 6. It would ultimately be defiled by King Josiah, so that it could not be used for that anymore. But it's not contaminated by what would be ultimately become the garbage dump in Jesus' day. The Hinnom Valley in Jesus' day on the south side becomes the garbage dump for Jerusalem. And when he talks about the place where the fire never dies and the worms never die and the fire's never quenched, that's the Hinnom Valley, because they had to burn the trash for sanitary purposes. And anything flowing through there would flow down to En Rogel. Well, this is a symbolically, it's uphill, it's a higher place, it's a cleaner place, just a better sight all around. So you take the mule, that's the sign of the king's authority. People would recognize that. You take Solomon to Gihon and you anoint him there. And then after you do that, you blow the trumpet, you shout, you say, long live King Solomon. and you come up after him and put him on my throne, bring him up to the palace and put him on my throne. That's the one thing Adonijah has not tried to do yet. Come and possess the palace. And so this is what they do. Benaiah, one of the mighty men, greets this with a blessing of joy. He's rejoicing in this. And you have the parallel to this over in 1 Chronicles chapter 29, what's about to take place here. You flip over to 1 Chronicles chapter 29 and start at verse 22. At verse 18, David blessed the Lord in the presence of the assembly. Blessed are you, O Lord God of Israel, our Father, forever and ever. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty, for all that is in the heavens and the earth is yours. Yours is the kingdom, O Lord. You are exalted as head above all, and so on and so forth. And you get down here to, that's at verse 10, get down here to verse 22. They made Solomon, the son of David, king the second time, and anointed him as prince for the Lord, and Zadok as priest. Then Solomon sat on the throne of the Lord as king in place of David his father, and he prospered, and all Israel obeyed him. All the mighty men and so forth likewise obeyed him. So they anoint him at the Gihon spring. They bring him up to the palace, and they acclaim him king there. And so you pick up back here at 1 Kings chapter 1 at verse 38. This is what they're doing. Now, notice what happens. Verse 39, Zadok anoints Solomon with the horn of oil. They blow the trumpet. They shout, "Long live King Solomon." The people go up after him. There's logic in this. There's strategy in this. They're closer to Jerusalem. Just in raw distance, they're closer to the city. Both sites are in sight of the city. But where Adonijah is, he's way off down in the valley down there. And Solomon, he's just right there. For Adonijah to come into Jerusalem, he's got to come all the way up the valley and up the hill, up the mountain, to the head of the Kidron or the Hinnom Valley, either way, and circle around to get in. Solomon and those supporting him, they're just right there. Basically, it's just a short walk up, and they're in the city. The people in the city could see the sacrifices going on at En Rogel from a distance. They might put two and two together. Something big is going on down there, but it's far enough they can't just trot down there and see immediately. It's a bit of a walk. Where Solomon is, they can stand on the edge of the hill and look down and see exactly what's going on, and they can hear clearly what's going on. It's not that far. So they bring Solomon into the city. All the people went up after him, everybody that's there, playing on pipes, rejoicing with great joy. The earth was split by their noise. They made a ruckus. The coronation of a new king is a big deal. And they're celebrating. Now, is this the king that they expected? Maybe not. David had a house full of sons, and Adonijah is the oldest remaining son. He'd be the normal choice, just from a political point of view. But just like Jacob bypassed Reuben and Simeon and Levi because of their sins, they disqualified themselves to be firstborn. So here, David bypasses Adonijah, the one who's trying to just reach out and take what David has not yet given him, in favor of Solomon. You get down here to verse 41, and at verse 41, now Adonijah and his group can hear something's going on in the city. They hear shouting and celebration. It may be that they're hoping, oh, the people have figured out what we're doing and they're celebrating for us. But Joab is about the same age as David. He's an older man. And if we know one thing about Joab, what is it? He's a schemer. He is a politician. He wants to be the power behind the throne. And boy, Adonijah fits the bill for him to pull his strings. Joab may have had a big part in orchestrating what Adonijah has done. Now, clearly, Adonijah has all the ambition, but Adonijah had gone to Joab. Go back here to chapter 1 and verse 7. He conferred with Joab, so Joab knows what Adonijah's up to, and he supports him in it. All this celebrating in the city, that's not part of our plan. So what is this uproar? Abiathar's son, Jonathan, comes in at this point. This is not good news, fellas. King David, our Lord King David, has made Solomon king and sent him with Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada and the Cherethites and the Pelethites. And they had him ride on the king's mule, and Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet have anointed him king at Gihon and gone up from there rejoicing, so that the city is in an uproar. That's what you're hearing. They're celebrating Solomon, not you. And on top of that, guess where he is? He's on the throne. So what Nathan and Bathsheba accomplished basically is an end run around Abiathar's scheming. Around Adonijah's scheming with Abiathar and Joab. The significant thing here comes at verses 47 and 48, where King David bows to the new king. You look at verse 47, 48. The king's servants came to congratulate our Lord King David, saying, may your God make the name of Solomon more famous than yours, and make his throne greater than your throne. And the king bowed himself on the bed. By doing that, what David has done in the sight of witnesses is transfer his authority to Solomon. He has acknowledged Solomon as the king. Now, David's not dead yet, but at this point, there's no hope for Adonijah's claim short of a civil war. And Adonijah's supporters just, the enthusiasm for Adonijah as king just dries up. They each trembled and rose and went to his own way. And Adonijah feared Solomon and rose and went and took horns of the altar, took hold of the horns of the altar. Now, a few good men, a few faithful people in the right place, willing to do the right thing, can accomplish great things. Adonijah seems to have had a lot more people present than Solomon did in the beginning. But a few people doing the right thing at the right time can accomplish great things. So Adonijah goes and takes hold of the horns of the altar. Well, in Exodus chapter 21 and verse 14, when God is giving Moses instructions concerning building the tabernacle and all the furniture and so forth, Exodus 21:14, this is a protection for someone who has accidentally killed somebody else, committed homicide. This is not for a deliberate murderer. We'll see later on that someone who has committed murder tries to go and take hold of the horns of the altar. Solomon just, nope, no refuge there for you. But before this, In the ancient days, if somebody accidentally killed somebody else, because of the concept of blood guilt, the blood still had to be avenged. They could go and take hold of the horns of the altar, and they were safe until sacrifice could be offered to avenge that bloodshed. Now in the land of promise, now in the days of the kings, you've got 6 cities of refuge that serve that purpose. So really, Adonijah is looking at this saying, I don't have time to get to one of the cities of refuge. So he's going to go back to the old ways, as it were, and grab hold of the horns of the altar. The horns of the altar symbolize the seat of power, the seat of authority and strength. So in essence, what he's doing is he's going and saying, I'm going to plead my case before God, so to speak. But of course, he had no right to claim that refuge. Number one, he hadn't committed murder, and that's what that was for. But number two, what he was doing was tantamount to murder, because he was claiming something that ultimately would have undoubtedly have led to the death of David, just like Absalom wanted to. Now, what could Solomon do? Solomon could leave him there to starve, because once he's there, he's stuck there until his case is decided. And if he's left there on his own, he's subject to death. So you look down here at verses 50 and 51 in chapter 1. Adonijah feared Solomon, took hold of the horns of the altar. It was told to Solomon, he has laid hold of the horns of the altar. Let King Solomon swear to me first that he will not put his servant to death with the sword. This is what he wants. I'm not going to let go till Solomon promises he won't kill me. Well, can we say hypocrite? He had put things in motion to set Solomon up to be liable for death, for not supporting him when Solomon didn't know. But now Solomon has succeeded where he failed, because it was of God. And so Solomon's reply is basically, he doesn't have a thing to worry about. He is perfectly safe as long as he's faithful. Look at how he expresses this in verse 52. If he will show himself a worthy man, not one of his hairs shall fall to the earth. Do right, you're good. But if wickedness is found in him, he shall die. So King Solomon sent, and they brought him down from the altar, and he came and paid homage to King Solomon, and Solomon said to him, you go home. So at this point, everything should be fine. Adonijah, you're safe. You don't have to worry about me. I don't have any designs on you. We're good, as long as you behave. Solomon's forgiveness is conditional, which shows us right off the bat he was, he's going to say to God when God offers him great blessings, I'm young, I'm inexperienced, I don't know how to handle things. Well, that was all true. But he wasn't totally naive in his own right. He actually showed a good bit of intelligence right here, even though he's a young man. So his forgiveness is conditional. And now we get to chapter 2, and this parallels over in 1 Chronicles 29, David's last instructions. And it's interesting to look at the instructions here. There are 5 or 6 points here in the first 9 verses of chapter 2 that basically you could build a sermon or a Bible lesson about this. You could use this with grown-ups. You could use this with young people, with young men particularly. How to be a man. Here's how to be a man, verses 2 and 3. Keep the Lord's charge. David's time to die drew near. He commanded Solomon his son, saying, I'm about to go the way of all the earth. Here's what you do. Be strong. Show yourself a man. keep the charge, keep the commandment of the Lord your God, walk in all of his ways, keep his statutes, keep his commandments, keep his judgments, his rules, keep his testimonies. If you walk with God, God will walk with you. That's the gist of what he's telling you here. If you walk with God, God will walk with you. And look at verse 4. And if you do these things, the Lord will establish his word that he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons pay close attention to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. So in other words, Solomon, if you just do this, it's not hard, just do right. It's not hard to understand. Just do the right thing. Then you'll have descendants that'll rule after you, and my lineage will be established. God has promised that. But now pick up at verse 5, and in verses 5 and 6, David hasn't forgotten about Joab. Joab has been a very, what's the right word? Joab has been a very competent general for David. He's very good at what he does. But just because he's good at what David pays him to do doesn't make him a good person. You remember, he had murdered Abner. He had murdered Amasa. He had been responsible for the death of Absalom. And David had not overlooked those things, but he basically withheld judgment because he needed Joab. So in verses 5 and 6, you also know what Joab, the son of Zeruiah, did to me, how he dealt with the two commanders of the armies of Israel, Abner and Amasa, whom he killed, avenging in time of peace for blood that had been shed in war, putting the blood of war on the belt around his waist and on the sandals on his feet. In other words, he took advantage of a circumstance not to take vengeance in a just way, but to settle a score for his own personal temperament. And so the instruction, act according to your wisdom, but do not let his hoary head, do not let his gray hair go down to the grave, go down to Sheol in peace. What's David doing? David is still, he has acknowledged Solomon as the king, but David is not dead. And so now he's giving Solomon instruction, you better deal with this guy. He's guilty of murder. His vengeance was not revenge for blood guilt. It was murder because the things that he had done, he had avenged things that took place in time of war during peacetime. So you deal with him. What would happen if Solomon left Joab alive? Well, number one, Adonijah is still alive. And Joab has shown himself over and over and over and over again to be a schemer and a plotter and a planner, and he wants to be the power behind the throne. That's why he threw in with Adonijah. That's why he had supported others previously. That's why he had engineered the bringing back of Absalom to the kingdom when he was separated because of his murder for Amnon. David has seen Joab for what he is, and he doesn't like what he sees. Now, you need to take care of him before he causes you a problem, Solomon. Get on down here to verse 7, and there's a contrast here. You deal with Joab, don't fool around with him, but you deal faithfully with the sons of Barzillai, the Gileadite. Let them be among those who eat at your table for the loyalty that they met with me when I fled from Absalom, your brother. Barzillai of Gilead. Barzillai, a man from the region where King Saul was from. Barzillai, a man who might very easily have been expected to be an enemy to the king. had turned out to be his friend and his supporter. And David's not going to forget that. So you take care of Barzillai and you give him a position of honor at your table, a position of honor in your court. You reward him. I'm not going to forget about him. And also Shimei, and deal with him. Shimei, the son of Gera, the Benjaminite from Bahurim, who cursed me with a grievous curse when I came down to Mahanaim. But then he came to meet me at the Jordan. I swore to him that I will not put you to death. Now, you don't hold him guiltless. You're a wise man. You'll know what you ought to do, and you shall bring his gray head down with blood to Sheol, to the grave. Why would David instruct Solomon to do something that he could have done himself? Well, look at 1 Chronicles chapter 3 and verse 4. Well, no, I'm getting ahead of myself here. These are the sons of David there. Shimei had cursed at David during the time that he was being hunted, and then come asking forgiveness. But the forgiveness was conditional. And it did not take away the penalty for what he had done. Now, it's time to pay the piper, so to speak. Verses 10 and 11.
May I?
Yes, go ahead. Miss Mary, I think that's your...
He was against David when David was fleeing Jerusalem. He was for David when David was coming back to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
In other words, it seems to me like he's on whoever's side he thinks is winning.
You're right.
He doesn't think.
He was very willing.
I muted you. Sorry.
No. He was very willing to be David's booster and supporter as long as David was in power. When he thought that he could curry favor with Absalom, now he's after David. So he's playing both sides against the middle, as it were.
I can't hear you. I can't hear you.
I don't know why that would be. Let me see. I've got my volume turned all the way up.
I'm on my class.
Let me turn this around where I can get the keyboard. To Miss Mary.
I'm not able to hear also.
Okay, well, let me change this then. Just about.
I can. It was my end. Sorry about that. My end.
Okay. Well, it is basically time for us to go ahead and take a break. It may be a couple of minutes early, but this would be a good point since we're a little distracted at this point. It would be a good spot for us to stop and take a break. So we'll just break a few minutes early, and we'll reconvene in 15 minutes.
Okay. I did not hear your response to my question.
You are correct. Shimei basically was, I think I said playing both ends against the middle, which is not really an accurate description. He was, maybe we should say he's anybody's dog that would hunt with him.
Exactly.
He was interested in being on the winning side as he saw it than he was in being on the right side. So when David is fleeing from Absalom, he's cursing David. When Absalom is dead and David is coming back, he's cheering for David. And David forgives him conditionally, but his crime has not been answered for, really. And so David gives the instruction to Solomon, don't forget this has to be dealt with.
And there's nothing that indicates, in fact, everything indicates that he will not be faithful to Solomon, unconditionally faithful.
Well, he was, that's a good way to describe it. He was conditionally faithful because David was the winner.
Right.
David, at the time that he spared Shimei's life, David was heartsick over Absalom's death and sick of blood and gore and battle. And so in that moment, he was not ready for more blood and gore in executing judgment. But just because judgment was deferred did not mean that judgment was removed.
Or that it wasn't still deserved.
Yeah, here now, Solomon, we need to take care of this.
Okay.
So we'll stop here and reconvene in about 15 minutes at about 10 till. Let's get started again. And we have Solomon dealing with being instructed to deal with Joab, being instructed to deal with Barzillai and with Shimei. And then we have the death of David down here in chapter 2. Slept with his fathers, buried in the city of David. At that time reigned over Israel 40 years, 7 years in Hebron, 33 years in Jerusalem. And Solomon sat on the throne and was firmly established. Well, 7.5 years, actually, if you want to be persnickety about it. So it's just a shade over 40 years, but 40 years in round terms. And we have Solomon firmly ensconced on the throne. And what happens? Remember back at the end of chapter 1, if Adonijah behaves, nothing to worry about. Adonijah. And you wonder if maybe Joab planted the seed of the idea or whatnot. Or maybe Adonijah was just scheming enough on his own. He comes to Bathsheba. Well, who's Bathsheba? Now she's the queen mother. She's Solomon's mother. Solomon is king. She is a woman of influence in the kingdom. A request. Adonijah is being cunning about this. Surely Solomon is not going to tell his mama no. Would you ask Solomon for me if I can have Abishag, the Shunammite, as my wife? Bathsheba, you have to wonder a little bit. Was she naive? Or did she simply not understand? Or, why would she seemingly sees no harm in that request. It seems to have been a well-known fact, at least among the family. David had not known Abishag. No harm from where she stands. Solomon has inherited all that was David, but there's no indication that he's taken any interest in any of David's wives. When we get down here to verse 19, Bathsheba goes to King Solomon to speak on behalf of Adonijah. And she says, I have one small request. Don't refuse me. And he says, basically says, anything you want. Well, this is not something he foresaw, obviously. Your brother wants Abishag as his wife. So Bathsheba makes the request, and what does Solomon see? There's a plot here. And his response, there's some sarcasm in his response, although given that it's his mother, maybe it was gently delivered. Look at his response. Why do you ask Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? Ask for him the kingdom also. For he's my older brother, and on his side are Abiathar the priest and Joab the son of Zeruiah. God do so to me and more also, if this request, if this word does not cost Adonijah his life. So, for him to ask for Abishag was tantamount to asking for a claim to the throne. Well, he's already tried to take the throne on the sly and been thwarted in that by David's response and the actions of Nathan and Bathsheba. This is a plot to have a claim on the throne.
Why? Abishag was the girl that was to keep David warm, right?
Yes, but she is counted as part of his harem, part of his wives, his concubines.
Right.
Solomon, as king, inherits all that is David's. So basically, she's Solomon's now. Whether he has any interest in her or not is beside the point. She's Solomon's. If he gives her to Adonijah because she had been David's, that gives Adonijah a claim to the throne. Remember, when Absalom tried to take the kingdom by force, what's one of the things he did? You go back to 2 Samuel 16, and in verse 22, sets up a tent on the roof of the palace in the sight of the whole nation, and the concubines and the women that David had left behind, he took them there. And that was claiming what had been his father's. According to 2 Samuel 12 and verse 8, God said to David in the aftermath of Bathsheba, I'd have given you, I gave you all that was Saul's. I gave you his wives. You mean you got a handful of wives of your own. You've got Saul's harem too. Whether he ever made use of it or not, that's immaterial. He had it. He had those women. They belonged to him. And God says, I'd have given you more if that's what was needed. Of course, God knew what was needed and what wasn't. But the point is, all that had been David's had become Solomon's by royal right. Now, Solomon, you think about this, Solomon is a young man. How old is he? 20, 25 maybe? He may have not just seen the potential plot here, the potential claim to try to worm into a position where he could overthrow Solomon by Adonijah. But you look at the Song of Solomon, chapter 6, verses 10 through 13. Take your Bible and flip over to Song of Solomon for a minute. And just look at chapter 6 and start at verse 10 and notice what Solomon writes there. Who is this who looks down like the dawn, beautiful as the moon, bright as the sun, awesome as an army with banners? And then the woman's response. I went down to the nut orchard to look at the blossoms of the valley, to see whether the vines had budded, whether the pomegranates were in bloom. Before I was aware, my desire set me among the chariots of my kinsman, a prince. Return, return, O Shulamite. Return, return, that we may look upon you. Why should you look upon the Shulamite as upon a dance between or before two armies? So you have this back and forth between the woman and the man as Solomon is recording this, and you look at the end of it, Why should you look at this? Why should others see this? It may well be Solomon is jealous, not necessarily of Abishag per se, but jealous from the standpoint of, who are you kidding? You're asking me to give up what belongs by right to me. How dare you? But as we look at this, one of the things that Solomon points out in his response to his mother is, this is not just an innocent request by Adonijah, because Adonijah is in league with Abiathar and Joab, and he sees the machinations of these three in this. A claim like this is a claim against the throne. It's basically saying, hey, I have a right to this, not just you. It would have been interpreted by the people as saying, he's a legitimate rival. And he was not a legitimate rival because David had specifically named Solomon. So that takes Adonijah out of the picture. Well, to try to make that claim, that's treason. Remember what Adonijah had done. You go back to the end of chapter 1, King Solomon sent, they brought Adonijah from the altar. He came and paid homage to King Solomon. In other words, he swore loyalty to him. And now by doing this, he's saying, well, I had my fingers crossed, so to speak. So at verse 25, Adonijah is executed. Now, that sounds harsh because Adonijah is his half brother. He's a son of the king, son of David, but he's also a scheming, plotting rascal. King Solomon sent Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, and he struck him down and he died, executed him, removed him. Third of David's sons to die by the sword. Absalom murdered Amnon. Joab murdered Absalom. Now, Adonijah is not murdered, but executed. There's a distinction there. And you flip over to 2 Samuel chapter 12 and just look at what Nathan foretold. 2 Samuel chapter 12 and verse 10. The consequence of David's sin with Bathsheba and his murder of Uriah, specifically the murder of Uriah. Therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me, have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Consequences are far-reaching, long-lasting. Now, you pick up at verse 26, we're going to get Abiathar out of the way. At verse 26, to Abiathar the priest, the king said, go to Anathoth, to your estate. You deserve death. But I will not at this time put you to death, because you carried the ark of the Lord God before David my father, and because you shared in all my father's affliction. So Solomon expelled Abiathar from being priest to the Lord, thus fulfilling the word of the Lord that he had spoken concerning the house of Eli in Shiloh. That takes us way back to before David, to before Saul, way back to when Samuel was just a boy. And what had God said? Eli, your descendants, I've rejected you because Eli's sons were ungodly men. Well, this tells us that Eli's sons must have had children before they died in battle, and that those children had gone on being priests in the lineage of their fathers and their grandfather. But now Abiathar is rejected. He's not executed, but he's exiled from the priesthood, from the high priesthood at this point. Now, in 1 Samuel chapter 2, in verses 31 to 35, you have a lineage of the priests from Aaron on down, and they divide. Aaron had 4 sons. He had Nadab and Abihu, and they both died in Leviticus chapter 10. because they offered strange fire to the Lord, and they died childless. But he has two other sons, Eleazar and Ithamar. And the lineages are given. You have Eleazar and Phinehas and Abishua and Buki and Uzi and Zerahiah and Merioth and Amariah and Ahitub and Zadok on one side. And then Ithamar's sons, you have Ithamar, and apparently there's a gap in there that we don't know several generations, but it picks up with Eli, Samuel's Eli, and Phinehas, his son, and Ahitub and Ahiah and Ahimelech and Abiathar in 1 Samuel chapter 22. So the Zadok that's here with Solomon and Abiathar, who had been with David in the wilderness, they're cousins. They're both priests. But now Abiathar he's ruined himself basically by his alliance with Adonijah. So Adonijah's executed. Abiathar is that's a good word. Thank you. I was going to say he's, in a sense, he's excommunicated, and that's not really a good word because that's not what happened here. But he is removed from any influence as priest. And so you come to chapter 2, verses 28 and 29. Now we're going to deal with Joab. The news came to Joab. He had supported Adonijah, although he had not supported Absalom. Joab fled to the tent of the Lord, caught hold of the horns of the altar, and it was told King Solomon, Joab has fled to the tent of the Lord. He's beside the altar. And Solomon sends Benaiah, go strike him down. Yeah. Benaiah becomes the executioner. Joab, former chief of staff, former winning general and so forth, he's trying to claim sanctuary, trying to claim safety. Sorry, buddy, that's not for you. Go back to the book of Exodus, like we talked about earlier. That was for manslaughter, for accidental death. You've committed murder, and more than once. And that murder has not been avenged. Now, notice the instruction, go strike him down. Keep reading at verse 30. Benaiah came to the tent of the Lord, said to him, the king commands, come out. But he said, no, I will die here. Then Benaiah brought the king word again, saying, thus said Joab, and thus he answered me. And the king replied to him, do as he has said, strike him down and bury him, and take away from me and my father's house the guilt for the blood that Joab shed without cause. So there's a concept here. Joab has been the chief of staff. He's been a prominent man in the kingdom, the representative of David and nominally of Solomon at this point, Saul before that. His actions in his official capacity are a reflection on the king. And the guilt of his actions, if they're left unanswered, the guilt of his actions by extension extend to the king. Now, why did Benaiah not just go cut him off right there? Well, he's in the tabernacle. He's at the horns of the altar of sacrifice. And Benaiah is the son of a priest, which is an interesting conundrum in its own right, because Levites were not normally warriors, but to be the son of a priest, he is a Levite. But he may not have wanted to commingle Joab's blood there at the altar with the blood of legitimate sacrifices. And so he goes back to Solomon and says he won't come out. And Solomon's response basically is, fine, kill him where he lies. Kill him there. He's guilty of at least 2 murders. He has no asylum claim. And furthermore, David had cursed him back in 2 Samuel chapter 3 because of his murderous behavior. And so, fine, Come down to verse 34. Well, all right. You look at verse 33, the Lord will bring back his bloody deeds on his own head. Without the knowledge of my father David, he attacked and killed with the sword 2 men more righteous and better than himself, Abner and Amasa. So shall their blood come back on the head of Joab and his descendants forever. David and his descendants, and for his house there shall be peace from the Lord forevermore. In other words, we're going to avenge this, and that gets us off the hook, so to speak. Then Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, went down and struck him down, put him to death, and he was buried in his own house in the wilderness. And the king put Benaiah over the army in place of Joab, and Zadok the priest in place of Abiathar. So Abiathar is expelled as high priest, and Zadok becomes the high priest. He's replaced. That's unusual because ordinarily, how did the high priesthood change? Death. That's right. The current high priest had to die and then be replaced. But he's disqualified himself by his disloyalty, and so now he has to be replaced. So you come down then to 36 to 46, we're going to deal with Shemaiah. Come build yourself a house in Jerusalem. Live here. Don't go anywhere else. You can live in Jerusalem. That's, you think about that. That's, Solomon is offering him his life. You don't leave town. You cross the Kidron, and you're signing your own death warrant. Your blood will be on your own head. So Shemaiah does that. And he lived in Jerusalem many days. At the end of 3 years, 2 of Shemaiah's servants ran away to Achish, the king of Gath, ran away to the Philistines. And so Shemaiah is going to go get his servants. Dumb Shemaiah. You leave town, you die. Is your life worth more than a couple of servants? Apparently not to Shemaiah. You promised to obey me. When he's confronted by the king, you promised to obey me. Why have you violated your oath to the Lord and the commandment that I gave? You know in your own heart all the harm you did to David, my father. The Lord will bring back your harm on your own head. But King Solomon shall be blessed, and the throne of David shall be established. And the king commanded Benaiah, and he went out and struck him down, and he died. So he's finished with his father's instructions finally. He's deferred. He's shown patience and grace, and he's been abused. And that's the end of it. Be sure your sins will find you out. You think about what brought this about for Shemaiah. 2 of his servants ran away, 2 slaves, apparently. It's not like violating the commandment was the only option that he had. He's right there in Jerusalem. Where does King Solomon live? Right there. Could he not go ask for help? Could he not go ask permission to send somebody? Could he not? I mean, he had servants. Could he not ask Solomon to send somebody? And it cost him his life. But even that's not quite the end of the story, because jump over to Esther chapter 2, and guess what? That's First Chronicles here, Second Chronicles. You look at Esther chapter 2, and Shemaiah has righteous, honorable descendants. In chapter 2, there was a Jew in Susa, Shushan, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair. Do what?
What verse?
Chapter 2, verse 5. Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. Shimei was one of Saul's brothers. And now here we are. You've got Mordecai, Esther's cousin or uncle, depending on the translation you're reading from, who turns out to be a righteous man. Everybody who could be a threat to Solomon at this point from within the kingdom, everybody who could be a threat to Solomon except Solomon himself has been removed. Solomon's downfall will come from within. Solomon will be the cause of his own downfall. Now, Solomon believed and practiced the things that he was inspired to write. If you look at Proverbs chapter 19, the discretion of a man makes him slow to anger, and it's to his glory to overlook a transgression. Proverbs 19 and verse 11. Well, you see that in Solomon. He was not hasty. He was slow to anger, and he was willing to overlook transgressions. Flip a page, Proverbs 20 and verse 2. The wrath of a king is like the roaring of a lion. Whoever provokes him to anger sins against his own life. Last year, I was in the National Cemetery at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio. And as we were walking among the headstones, in recent years, the Department of Veterans Affairs that administers the national cemeteries has loosened the rules a little bit for what can be put on a headstone. Now, it's not just name, rank, and birth and death dates. You can put, beloved father or husband or whatnot as well. And military dependents, spouses, or disabled children are also allowed to be buried in the National Cemetery. So my father and my mother and my brother are all buried there at Fort Sam Houston. But as we were walking among the headstones, we ran across one that was it was quite humorous. When they bury a husband and wife, because of space limitations, they bury them stacked. And the husband or the service member's data is on one side of the headstone, and the spouse's is on the back side. So on the front of this headstone is Lieutenant Colonel so-and-so, birth and death, and United States Army or Air Force or what have you. And on the back side is his wife's information. And where other stones might say, beloved wife and mother or whatnot, this one says, shh, don't poke the bear. The wrath of a king is like the roaring of a lion. Whoever provokes him to anger sins against his life. And he's just like, shh, don't poke the bear. Don't do something dumb. Skip down in Proverbs 20 to verse 8. A king who sits on the throne of judgment scatters all evil with his eyes. And then down to verse 26, a wise king sifts out the wicked and brings the threshing wheel over them. He distinguishes between the wicked and the innocent and punishes the wicked. So Solomon practiced what he preached, in a sense, at least part of his life. In his early life, he did. It didn't seem to stick with him. In chapter 3, you have to wonder a little bit about him. We start out, most Bibles will head this Solomon's Prayer for Wisdom, if you got little subtitles in the margins of your Bible or wherever. But that's not where this actually begins. This actually begins with a wedding. Solomon married Pharaoh's daughter. Yep. What in the world would possess him to marry Pharaoh's daughter? Well, the English Standard probably has the right of it when it says he made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. It was a political marriage. And before everything is said and done, we'll find that Solomon has 700 wives and 300 concubines. And unless he is superhuman, that's almost certainly mostly political alliances. But he marries Pharaoh's daughter, brings her to the city of David until he finishes building his own house and the temple and the wall around the city. The people were sacrificing in the high places because there's no temple, no house built for the Lord yet. And the very next thing we read is Solomon loved the Lord. Now, Egyptians, of all the people that Israel was forbidden to marry, Egyptians were not among them. But how many times had God warned his people, don't marry a foreign woman? Foreign meaning not from another place, but meaning an idolater. And this woman would be an idolater. So we read the very next verse, Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father, but he sacrifices and makes offerings at the high places, goes to Gibeon to sacrifice there, used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. And there is where the Lord appears to him. Okay. The marriage is not a violation of the law, according to Exodus chapter 34 and Deuteronomy chapter 7. There's no record that this is one of the women that turned Solomon away from the Lord, but still, she's a foreigner. You can almost see Bathsheba saying, "There's not a nice Jewish girl for you." But anyway.
Dave,
Yes, ma'am.
that reminds me, in 2 Chronicles chapter 1,
Yep.
verse 16 and 17, Solomon is importing horses and chariots
Yep.
from Egypt and selling them to foreign countries.
Yep.
And
He's already a big trader.
yeah, but it just, considering that he married an Egyptian wife, I'm sure I would think that would be one thing that
Maybe
sort of,
the deal.
yeah.
You know, it may be as simple as Pharaoh saying, "Hey, I've got a fat, cross-eyed daughter I need to get rid of, and you want to do business with me?" I don't know. Regardless, the very next thing is he loved the Lord, he was faithful, and now God appears to him. And look at the blank check that God gives him. Ask what I shall give you. That's as much as saying, what do you want? You name it. How would we respond to that kind of an offer? Solomon is king. By definition, compared to the people around him, he's already wealthy, although he's not, as the saying goes, he's not yet dirty, rotten, filthy, stinking rich. He's just rich. He's maybe not even rich at this point, but he's arguably the richest man in Israel. He's king. He rules. What would we ask for in that setting, that scenario? More money? More territory? More wives? We look at that, and the average individual just reading over this, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Something in this world. Something to have, to possess, to control, to use. And look at Solomon's response. Well, don't you wish he was as smart at the end of his life as he was at the beginning? You have shown great steadfast love to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness and righteousness and uprightness of heart toward you. Pause there for a second. How many times did David not walk uprightly before the Lord? Boy, we could just make a list. But the key there is uprightness of heart toward you. David got far away from God at times in his sins, but he always came back. His heart was always tender enough to repent and return. Now you've made your servant king in place of David, my father, though I am but a little child. Well, he's not a little child. He's a relatively young man. Your servant is in the midst of your people whom you've chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted. You ask what I want? I want to do a good job. That's what it comes down to. He says, I want to be a good king. Give your servant an understanding mind, wisdom to distinguish between good and evil. Who's able to govern this great people? Your great people. Temple's not yet built. Why the tabernacle is not the place of sacrifice is never stated, except that at one point the Ark of the Covenant is here and the tabernacle, whatever's left of it, is there. That goes back to Saul's days and even to the time of the judges. Solomon is zealous to worship God. Apparently he wants to do it right. He's offering sacrifices. They worship in the high places. It was a compromise. Seemingly God is willing to accept that at this point in time. We might make the case that this is something of a transitional period between the tabernacle and the temple. I don't know that we could validate that, but that seems to be a reasonable explanation. Solomon is offering sacrifices at Gibeon. It's a great sacrifice from a sincere heart. In fact, flip over to 2 Chronicles chapter 1 for a minute. Just look at verses 2 through 6. Solomon spoke to all Israel, the commanders of thousands and hundreds, judges, leaders, and heads of fathers' houses. They went to Gibeon, and you have this enormous offering detailed there. 1,000 burnt offerings on the bronze altar there. That's a huge, huge investment, a huge sacrifice. And he's not holding anything back. So God appears, offers him, ask what you want. And here's what he asks: give me wisdom, give me an understanding heart. Now, for what it's worth, God is going to appear to Solomon 2 more times. Flip over to chapter 9 and verse 2, and there God is going to appear to warn him. First, he appears to offer him blessing here in chapter 3. Chapter 9, verse 2, the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time, as he had at Gibeon, and said, I've heard your prayer and your plea. I have consecrated this house by putting my name there forever. And this is his response to the building and the dedication of the temple. But notice how the response goes. Verse 4, if you will walk before me as David your father walked, with integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded you, keeping my statutes and my rules, then I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised. But if you don't, now just turn the page and look at chapter 11. First, he promised, he gave him the offer, ask what you will. Second, he appears to warn him, don't forget, walk uprightly. Chapter 11, start at verse 9. The Lord was very angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the God who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing that he should not go after other gods, but he did not keep what the Lord commanded. Therefore, the Lord said, since this has been your practice and you have not kept my covenant, my statutes, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant. But I won't do it during your lifetime. In other words, I'm going to split the kingdom. Well, he's looking down the stream of time to Rehoboam and Jeroboam and the foolishness that attended that whole era. Now, if this sacrifice at Gibeon in chapter 3 had not been acceptable to God, then it's a reasonable supposition God would not have come to Solomon with that type of vision. Ask what I should give you. Ask what you want. Think about this. That offer is made to every single soul. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what your background is. It doesn't matter what your family is. If you're poor or rich or somewhere in between, what does God offer us? He opens the gates of heaven and says, this can all be yours. Reign with me, Jesus says. Share in my kingdom. He offers us everything he offered Solomon and then some. And how do most people respond? We're blinded by temptation. We let ourselves be blinded by temptation. You ever watch little children blowing bubbles with soap bubbles? And what do they try to do with the bubbles? What does every child try to do with the bubbles? I want to try to catch that bubble. And of course, the minute you touch it, it's gone. Those rare occasions that you've got enough soap on your fingers that you can touch the bubble and it doesn't immediately pop. You look at it and you're amazed, and then what does it do? It's gone. That's what temptation is. Temptation is a soap bubble. It's pretty, it's shiny, it's colorful, it fascinates us, and it leaves us with nothing good. We fail when God offers us heaven, because we're more focused on temptation. What does Paul say? Behold the goodness and the severity of God. He offers life, he offers death. And what do most people choose? Most people are dumb enough to choose death. But we come on down through here, chapter 6, you get to chapter 3 rather, you get to verse 6. Solomon gives thanks to God, shows his humility in verses 7 and 8, asks the Lord to establish his kingdom as he had promised to David. 2 Chronicles chapter 1 verse 9 is the parallel there. He shows humility. Grant your servant wisdom and an understanding heart. And look at the Lord's response at verse 10. God was pleased. Solomon asked for, in essence, the greatest of all gifts, a heart to be God's man. And God was pleased. Because you've asked this, not asked long life or riches or the life of your enemies, you haven't been focused on yourself. You've asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right. I will do according to your word. I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall arise after you. I give you also what you have not asked, riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all your days. But it's a conditional promise. If you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. Solomon awoke. It was a dream. He came to Jerusalem, stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, offered up burnt offerings and peace offerings, and made a feast for all his servants. God grants his request plus everything he could have asked for, but didn't. And it's all conditional. Miraculous in a sense, but it did not take away his free will. It did not take away his ability to fall from grace. Goes back to Jerusalem, offers more sacrifices in the presence of the Ark of the Covenant. So that tells us that the Ark of the Covenant is not out there on the high place at Gibeon. It's still there in Jerusalem. And the rest of chapter 3 shows us Solomon applying what God had given him. 2 women. The English Standard Version says 2 prostitutes, which is not very flattering to them. Here's the thing about the children. We both had children. After I gave birth, 3 days later, this woman gave birth. Nobody else there with us. This woman's child died in the night. She swapped babies. And she says that that's her child. I say that's my child. We need you to decide. Solomon's decision. Solomon's decision is calculated to expose who's really the mother, who really cares about the child. Divide the child in half and give half to each woman. Well, what's half a baby worth? Half a baby is worth the life of the child of the true mother. I'd rather give up my child and see it live than be vindicated and see it die. Solomon's final judgment comes after all the facts are in. Israel heard of the judgment, verse 28. They stood in awe of the king because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. Now, think about this. How many times can we look back? You know, they say hindsight is what? Hindsight is 20/20. You see perfectly in the rear view mirror what you should have done in this or that situation. And at the time, when you're looking back, well, it was so easy. It was so obvious. It wasn't obvious in the moment. Solomon's insight, the speed, the firmness, the compassion of this judgment, those are not normal. It shows his wisdom. Chapter 4 then introduces us to how he ran the kingdom, the administration of the kingdom. Tells of his princes in verses 1 through 6. Azariah, the son of Zadok, becomes the priest. Elihoreph and Ahijah, the sons of Shisha, were the secretaries, and Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was the recorder. Benaiah was in command of the army. Zadok and Abiathar were priests, and so on and so forth down through here. Solomon had 12 officers over all Israel who provided food for the king and his household. Each man had to make provision for 1 month in the year, and here are their names. And he goes on and talks about all of the administration of the kingdom. Now, it's interesting to look at this from the standpoint of what it cost Israel to have a king. 1 man from each tribe, responsible for the king's expenses for a month, basically. Give us a king so we can be like the nations around us. 1 Samuel chapter 8. Really? He's going to tax you. We want to be like the nations. He's going to tax you a lot. Well, you know that these guys turned around to their respective tribes and taxed them to pay the king's taxes. But notice in verses 11 and 15, 2 of these guys were sons-in-law to the king. Ben-Abinadab in all Naphath Dor, he had Tapheth, the daughter of Solomon, as his wife, verse 11. And then down here at verse 15, Ahimaaz in Naphtali had taken Basemath, the daughter of Solomon, as his wife. So 2 of these were sons-in-law. They paid a long time for their wives, didn't they? As you go forward, we move from the administration of the kingdom to the acquisition of wealth. God gave Solomon wisdom, discernment. And then he also said, I'll give you what you didn't ask for but could have. And boy, when God opens the windows of heaven, look at all of this. Judah and Israel were as many as the sand by the sea, ate, drank, and were happy. It was a prosperous time. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and from the border of Egypt, or to the border of Egypt. And they brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. Now, Solomon's going to live 40 years, and the Euphrates is way over there in the Fertile Crescent down toward Arabia. We're going back toward the direction where Abraham had come from. So this is not just little skinny Israel. This is all of a big part of the Arabian Peninsula and up into the upper parts of the Middle East. Solomon covers a lot of territory. His provision for one day. This is, why do we care what it took to run the kingdom, as it were, to feed everybody? It tells us how prosperous, how rich he was, how big and powerful. He had to provide for all of these people. One day was 30 cores of fine flour, 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened fowl. He had quite a house full to feed. The amount here, if you just break this down at a couple of pounds of bread and a pound to a pound and a half of meat per day, we're talking about thousands of people. Thousands of people every day. Now that's his whole palace staff and all of his counselors and everybody that eats at his table and everybody that he's responsible to support. This is territory, numbers that stagger our imagination. Think about the benevolent relief efforts that have gone on just in the last couple of years in different parts of the world, Haiti and places like that, and even in our own country, in Louisiana, and places that have been devastated by natural disasters, California even, and the truckloads and truckloads and truckloads of supplies that have been sent. And Solomon was providing that much, or it took that much to attend to Solomon's people every day. Boy, when they said, give us a king, they really did let themselves in for plenty in the way of taxation, didn't they? Now, let's go back to verse 21 for a minute. And something I want to point out here. At verse 21, you've got Solomon's territory. And notice what it says. He ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines. Well, if you flip over to 2 Chronicles chapter 9, 2 Chronicles chapter 9 and verse 26, you read, he ruled over all the kings from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. What's important about that?
What they're supposed to have?
Well, it shows the territory that was under Solomon's control.
He's got the whole coastline, it sounds like.
He's got the whole coastline all the way over to the Euphrates River.
Promised by God in the beginning, right?
Exactly. Now, here we are in the 21st century, and that's important for this reason. Because in our time, there is a religious philosophy called millennialism, premillennialism. Usually occasionally you find a post-millennial, but dispensational millennialism particularly holds out that The Jews are still God's chosen people even today, in spite of Christ, and that Jesus has to come and reign on a physical throne in Jerusalem for 1,000 years, because God never gave Israel all of the territory that they could have possessed. And they go back and they look at what was conquered in the days of Joshua and the judges. And what we see there is that what Joshua and the judges conquered falls short of the boundaries that God initially outlined to Moses. And so the millennialist comes along and says, see there, God has not yet finished fulfilling his promise. So Israel are still his chosen people. And Jesus has to come and reign on a throne in Jerusalem to fulfill that promise. That's a pinky nail schedule.
It was conditional, conditional, conditional.
Well, number one, it was conditional. Every tribe in the days of Joshua and the judges fell short of what they could have possessed. Even Judah didn't fully evict the Jebusites from what would become Jerusalem in those days. Every tribe fell short because they stopped short. God was with them, and anything they did not inherit in that moment, they did not inherit, they did not conquer, they did not receive and control because they quit, not because God quit. But that's not the end of the story for our millennialist friends, because here we are in Solomon's day. And if you look at a map and you go from the coastline to the Euphrates and all the way down to Egypt, guess what? Solomon not only ruled over every stitch of the territory that had been promised, he ruled over a bunch of territory that wasn't even part of that deal. So God exceeded what he had promised in the days of Solomon. So our millennialist friends don't have a leg to stand on about that God hasn't fulfilled his promise, hasn't finished fulfilling his promise business. You get down to 24 and 25, and peace was the rule in Solomon's day. He did have wars, he did have battles, but generally speaking, his rule was characterized by peace. Look, though, at verses 26 through 28, and guess what? Solomon kept a standing cavalry. And he really wasn't supposed to do that. Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots, 12,000 horsemen. Those officers supplied provisions for King Solomon and all who came to King Solomon's table, each one in his month. They let nothing be lacking, barley also, straw for the horses, swift steeds they brought to the place where it was required, each according to his duty. Now, what had Samuel warned the people? He'll draft your sons into the army. He'll draft your daughters into his harem. He'll tax you halfway to oblivion. And he's going to raise a standing army and have chariots and horses and things that he hasn't got any business having. And then turns around and warns Saul, don't do this. And what's one of the first things Saul does? This. And David, to a lesser extent, now Solomon passes them all by. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 16 and 17, your kings don't need to maintain a standing army. Kings don't need chariots and horses. What is the deal with chariots and horses? Why is that a big deal for these people? Why did God forbid that?
Chariot horses for war, right?
Yep. Number one, there you go. Number one, chariots and horses are weapons of offense, not defense. They're not for defensive war, they're for offensive war. Number two, chariots in that day were an advancement militarily. Remember, in Joshua's day, when they go into the land of promise, the Canaanites had chariots. The Israelites didn't. But what did the Israelites have? They had God. The Israelites were a Bronze Age people battling an Iron Age people with superior technology, but they had God on their side. God says, you don't need chariots and horses, you got me. So what do? They start collecting chariots and horses. It boggles the mind sometimes How dumb can you be? Well, pick up at verse 29. We're going to see some examples of Solomon's wisdom. God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure, breadth of mind like the sand of the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed all the wisdom of the people of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt, wiser than all other men, than Ethan the Ezrahite, Heman, Calcol, Darda, the sons of Mahal. His fame was in all the surrounding nations. Well, who are these guys? Calcol and Darda and Heman and so forth. Well, Heman, the Ezrahite, or Ethan the Ezrahite, Heman, these are people that would have been known for their wisdom, famous for their wisdom, their insight, their understanding in that ancient world. But notice verse 32, he spoke 3,000 proverbs, 105 songs. He spoke of trees, from the cedar in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He spoke also of beasts, birds, reptiles, fish. The people of all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. He had a reputation, and deservedly so. We'll be introduced to the Queen of Sheba in that connection eventually. What did God give Solomon? Wisdom, great understanding, largeness of heart, or generosity, the ability to be generous. Now, these guys that are listed, Ethan and Heman and Calcol and Darda, these are the sons of Jerah or Mahal, according to 1 Chronicles chapter 2 and verse 6. 3,000 proverbs, 105 songs or psalms. A big part of what Solomon wrote, we do not have, because there are not 3,000 verses in our book of Proverbs. There are a few hundred. There are not 1,005 Psalms of Solomon in the book of Psalms. There are 150, and half of them are not Solomon's, but David's. Most of them are not Solomon's. But Solomon had superior wisdom, superior understanding, even about nature, verses 33 and 34. And he was famous for it.
I have a question.
But go ahead.
All of these, the two books of Kings and the two books of Chronicles, I know you said that the second book of Chronicles was written in post-exile time period.
As far as we can tell, they're both post-exilic.
Okay, now what about the books of Kings?
They are generally thought to have been written more in the time of the events. Now, obviously, some of it is looking back, but this seems to be pre-exilic compared to post-exilic.
Well, the reason for my question, I liked how you, in the first class, made us think about why would all of this information have been written down after the exile.
Right.
And it strikes me as all of these books are sort of like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
This is why they failed, why Judah and Israel failed.
You've got in these books basically a blueprint for how to lose a kingdom.
Right, correct. And now are they wise enough to not follow the recipe?
Yeah. It's interesting that in Kings and Chronicles, in one sense, what you see is the record of God's people just almost systematically doing everything he tells them not to do. And you're right, just doing it time and time and time again. After the exile, the one thing you don't see in Jewish history from then until the time of Christ is what we might call organized idolatry.
Okay.
They never worship statues and images again. Now, I need to qualify that. Because what does Jesus say about the rulers of the Jews, particularly in Matthew 15 and verses 8 and 9? In vain they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. Their heart is far from me. They praise me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. They never worshiped idols in the conventional sense after Babylonian captivity. They never built temples and erected statues and offered sacrifices like they had done before the captivity. But even after captivity, they practiced idolatry in a sense in getting away from God and elevating their own traditions and their own teachings above the word of God, really. When Jesus says, you teach for doctrines the commandments of men, that's a direct contrast to the commandments of God. Think about the Sermon on the Mount. How many times does Jesus say, you have heard it said, thus and such and so, but I say unto you? In every case, the thus and so was not what the Old Testament actually said. It was a reference to their interpretation of it. You've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, whosoever looks on a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her already in his heart, for example. Well, the Old Testament said what? Go back to the 10 commandments. You shall not do what with respect to your neighbor's wife? You shall not covet. That doesn't say you shall not commit adultery with her. Well, that goes without saying. That's part of it. Coveting her, she might never know. But it literally gets to the heart, the mind of the individual. You don't entertain these kind of ungodly thoughts. But you come down to Jesus' day, and what's the teaching that the scribes and the Pharisees are giving? Don't commit the act, but they can't police what you're thinking. Oh, yes, God can. And that's the distinction Jesus makes. Well, our time is just about up. In chapter 5, 6, and 7, we have Solomon preparing to build the temple, renewing his relationship or furthering his relationship with Hiram, the king of Tyre. And we'll talk a little bit about that next time. Thankfully, in our schedule, we've got a little bit of leeway back and forth, and we'll be all right there. And so if you would read ahead, and we'll deal with that next week. Questions or comments?
A link to this video.
Yes, ma'am. I will post this and send it, probably send the link in the morning
Okay.
to the archive of it.
It seemed like class lasted about 15 minutes tonight.
Count that as a compliment. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
You have no idea how often it feels like I'm, as one brother said, talking out of my head, not crazy, but just there's so much here. It
Yeah.
feels like I'm rambling at times when I don't
No.
want to.
No, that's good. That's good. See you
Thank
next
you
week.
very much, Ms. Shante.
See you next week.
Y'all
Thank
take care. Well, Sam, I see your mic unmuted. You got comments or questions?
No, I just appreciate it, man. I'm learning so much here. It's so informative the way you're teaching the class. That
Well, I appreciate that, brother. I hope to have eventually some further handouts and some maps and a chart or two, but I haven't got there yet. So I'm working on that little by little. Y'all take care.
Thank you
God
so
willing,
much.
I'll see you next week. And in the meantime, I'll send you a link to the archive in the next 24 to 36 hours anyway.
Good night.
Good night, y'all.
good night.